Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, today I'm talking with Vanessa Bohns. Vanessa is a social psychologist and professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University. She has a degree from Brown University, a PhD in psychology from Columbia. She's taught at the NYU Stern School of Business. She's taught at the University of Toronto. Her work has been featured in many outlets such as New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic. And she is the author of her first book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. And that's what we talk about. The book's been out for over a year, I believe, and it is soon to be out in paperback. I read her book when it came out, and I really enjoyed it, and I was able to talk to her recently about it, and so subsequently I read it a second time, and I think we had an excellent conversation about many of the aspects of her book. We start by talking about influence as a human thing, as do other types of species or animals have influence, and we talk about what is it that makes influence such a very human thing. It's predominantly a human thing. We talk about what it is and how we define it, how there's a reciprocal nature to it. We talk about who we're being influenced by and what are the social norms for influence. We mentioned a little bit about social media and actual social influencers, things like that. We talk about why it's hard to ask for things and why it can be hard for some people to say no. We talk about the negative aspects of influence. We talk about influence in terms of dating and romantic relationships. And we spend towards the end of the conversation a little bit about this idea of power she talks about in her book. And, is how power can be a negative thing, but it can also be a positive thing. And we talk about the various dimensions, why responsibility is very important and connected with influence and power. And many other topics from her book. I absolutely love the conversation. I think it's a extremely important topic, and it's something that we encounter and think about probably on a daily basis, but just maybe not as conscious about it. And so her book is important now and for the future, and as we continue to kind of stumble our way through society, whether it's online or in real life. And so she has a lot of valuable insights to share. I can't highly recommend her work enough. And so now I bring you Vanessa Bohns. I'm here with Vanessa Bohns. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to talking to you. Your book's been out for a year now, and it just came out in paperback. Is that correct?
It's going to come out in February, but yes, it's been a year now.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. The book is called You Have More Influence Than You Think, How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. So tell us just who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me as well.
Of course.
So I am a professor of organizational behavior at Cornell, and I study social influence, but I do it in a little different way than other people tend to do it. So instead of sort of looking at how to gain influence and the sort of tips and tricks for doing so, I look at our intuitions about the influence we have and whether we think we're likely to convince someone of something if we ask in this way or that way. And so that is what my book really focuses on.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's an interesting topic because I feel like it doesn't get talked about in this way often. So as I was reading it, I was really intrigued by the kind of angle you took from. So just as you said, the humans have influence, and the one question I have is this an innate thing, right? Is this a human thing, or is it just some have it, or others have it, or is that more of just degrees, right? Some have it more than others, some have it less than others. How do you kind of see it in terms of maybe an evolutionary perspective, or just kind of a human thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that some people have it more. I mean, I wouldn't say that wasn't true. But I think that we exaggerate those differences, and we tend to underestimate in particular when, we don't have positional power, or, we're not the ones in the front of the room, that we also have influence all the time. And I do think it's, an innate thing. I don't know if I would use that exact word, but it's certainly, likely to be evolutionarily driven, because humans are social creatures. We've survived, being social creatures. And so that means that we pay a lot of attention to what other humans are doing, and we, want them to like us. And so we shape our behaviors and our beliefs to sort of match other people. We do things for other people, but we often forget that that is also happening in the opposite direction, that other people are doing that for us. They also are paying attention to us, shaping their preferences and attitudes towards what they think we like, and, are perfectly willing to help us out as well. And so again, that I think does come down to some basic evolutionary human sort of thing. And I think it's important to think of influence in that way, as opposed to, this idea of like, it's people with power, it's people with the microphone, it's also these just day-to-day interactions where people are paying attention to us and influenced by us.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that you mentioned, which was also interesting, was that many people are oblivious or less aware of the influence they potentially have that maybe they're not enacting upon or what have you. Why is that? Why are we oblivious to our influence? Is it just the whole megaphone thing? Like, people that have the megaphone, they're the ones that have it and I don't? Or why do you think we're less attuned to that, I guess?
I think a big part of it is that we have this idea of, influence as this thing that we can see and is very definitive. And, if I ask someone to do something, I'll see right in front of me whether they do it. If I make an argument, I'm going to totally change someone's mind. And that's how I'll know I have influence. But, influence is so much more subtle than that. It's so much more delayed often. It's often cumulative. And so often we impact people, and they don't necessarily show it on their faces or in their behavior or by telling us, oh, you've totally changed my mind. But they think about what we said more than we realize after they kind of walk away from the conversation. They may hear someone else say something similar, and now, like, together, there's this cumulative effect that we also had with this other person. They may, really feel a change internally, but not show it visibly in some way. And so I think because we miss all of that kind of those subtle cues of influence, or the, things that we don't see that happen when we're not there, we assume that we didn't have influence. And so, we also sort of remember the times that someone overtly sort of argued against us, or said we didn't influence them, or said no to us when we asked for something, right? All these sort of, the negative always looms larger than the positive, for so many things. And so we focus on that. And then there's all this invisible influence. And so we don't realize all these times someone is still sort of thinking about us after the fact.
We should probably define influence, I guess. That'd probably be a good thing to do. So how do you define influence? Maybe define it by what it is and then what it isn't. And then kind of the reciprocal aspect of it, of, that there's this idea of people are seeing us, whether we realize it or not, or kind of, you're saying, these kind of micro moments where they're remembering things. And then we see others. So maybe just kind of define influence, and then how it's the kind of reciprocal nature of it.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because I do think that you hear influence and you have this idea that, oh, we're talking about these moments where we're trying to like completely change someone's mind. We're talking about these like heated debates. We're talking about standing up in front of a crowd. And really, influence is just defined as any time we change another person's attitude or behavior. And that can be, in various ways, in subtle ways. It could be, something as simple as, the movie that they decide to go to. So it is these like everyday interactions. And it's also worth noting that change doesn't have to mean like reverse. It could mean like confirm something they already believe or are doing. So all those times we talk to our friends who believe the same thing as us, they're strengthening our belief, even though it doesn't seem like they're changing. In fact, they are deepening that belief. And so in terms of the reciprocal nature that you mentioned, that's the idea that, again, if we're sort of taking that perspective of influence is the person in the front of the room, it means we're forgetting that all those other people watching that person in front of the room are also impacting that person in front of the room, right? And so anyone who has stood in front of a room and given, a presentation or a talk, that you are scanning everybody's faces, trying to figure out like how are they reacting to what I'm saying, and adjusting based on what you're seeing. And so those people are also impacting you, how you talk about an issue, and ultimately, the research shows like how you wind up thinking about that issue after the fact.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I'll have clients and students tell me many times, weeks or months later, yeah, remember when you said this thing? And I'll be like, oh goodness, what did I say? I don't remember saying, what did I say? And then they'll repeat it to me and I'll say, oh yeah, that sounds like something I would say. I pride myself in my consistency, so I feel a little bit safer about that. But I'm like, oh man, was it one of those like off the cuff moments where I don't know, did I say something weird or something? And then I also have the same thing, right? Where I'll remember a random moment from years ago about one person I don't even talk to anymore. And it's very interesting how there's that impact. I want to ask about what is the comparison point, but I guess before I do that, in terms of the reciprocal aspect, I don't know if you say it this way, and maybe it's the wrong way to frame it, but is there a type of active and passive influence, right? Where there's a kind of just a receiving of sorts, where you're being influenced, whether you are aware of it or not. And then it will, kind of come to conscious later. And then is there more of an active thing where like, you go to a talk or something and you like want to have the, confirming the beliefs you have, or you go to a rally or you go to a whatever. Is there like an active passive component, or is that a wrong kind of way to look at it?
I don't know. I mean, those terms specifically, I haven't heard used, but people do talk about, there's a model called the Elaboration likelihood model, sounds very technical and everything, but basically about, how actively you are engaging with the material. Like, are you just kind of, like using heuristics to decide if you believe in what someone's saying, and like,
it's the central root and the peripheral root, correct?
Yeah. So like, am I actually, listening carefully to this argument? Am I being convinced by the content, or am I sort of making an assessment based on who's saying it, how articulate they are, and all these sort of peripheral aspects? And so that usually comes down to like how much you actually care about the issue, how much time you have to really delve into it and things like that. But that, to some extent, that might get at it, am I just sort of, half-ass like listening and deciding, or am I really engaging and actively deciding if, oh, you did change my mind because I believe that argument was really strong,
Yeah, I think it's the idea of, are you able to receive the information? Is the message interesting? What mood you're in? Something, how the person is, things like that. So who are we comparing ourselves to in terms of influence, right? Is it celebrities, other people like us, people that are dissimilar to us? Many times people will now use, in the kind of colloquial sense, I guess, social influencers, right? You'll hear this term obviously used. I'm sure you've been asked about this before. It's a very popular term. I mean, but I guess I'm getting at how much of society or culture is influence us, and how much do we impact that? What's, I guess, the kind of general heuristic here? Yeah,
so Sebastian Derry and Tom Gilovich. Sebastian was a graduate student here at Cornell, and Tom is a faculty member here at Cornell. And Shai Davide, they have a series of studies where they looked at who we compare ourselves to when we try to figure out basically like how social and cool we are. And so in that case, what they found was that we do tend to look at these exemplars of being super social and cool, like the people we see on Instagram who are always posting about parties and things like that.
Here's all the places I just traveled to. I was in Greece last week. I was in Spain the other couple months ago, that kind of thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the funny thing is that, obviously like we're at home, when we're doing this, sitting on the couch, being like, well, I'm not there, so I must not have a really active, interesting, social life. But then what we're not seeing is all the other people who are at the same time sitting on their couches, flipping through, those photos, feeling the same way.
Right.
And so because we are comparing ourselves to these exemplars of influence or, sociability or whatever it might be, we tend to underestimate our role as influencers. Like we think that we are less than we actually are. And one of my graduate students, Sangabe, and I also looked at this in the context of influence. And we asked people, like, compared to other people, do you think that you have more or less followers on Twitter, more or less followers on TikTok? Are your posts seen more or less than other people? And on average, people thought that they were below average, which of course is impossible. And the idea is the same as in Sebastian's studies, that we're just thinking of the people who have so many, connections on social media and post all this stuff and get all these views. And so we assume that we're at the bottom when in fact, on average, we're average, right?
Well, I guess it also depends on your reference point, right? I have plenty of people that I know and follow on Twitter that have, hundreds of thousands of followers. I don't, right? Thankfully. But then there's plenty of people that I also know that have less than me. But, on social media, that's a strange thing I think when people start evaluating kind of their worth or their identity or, whatever capital they have socially based on number of followers is an interesting way of doing that. I guess the one question I have here is how much are these, when you're looking at exemplars of these things, right? If we're looking to, again, celebrities, athletes, people that are the colloquial social influencers, how much of that is social norms? Why? I never understand this. Why people do that? I guess it's maybe because I don't do that. So I don't know. And I know other people that don't do that, but I don't understand why certain people are trendsetters in some ways. I don't really get it. And it's like, just do what you want and do what's interesting to you. But people really do look up to other folks that are at certain levels or in certain environments. Why do you think that is? Is it a social norm thing or moray or what's that about?
I think, a lot of it, can be explained by Bob Cialdini's, principles of persuasion, which he wrote about in his book Influence, which is like the classic sort of influence book, where we do, we want to see what other people are doing to know if we're weird or what we should do to be able to fit in, for those same motivations we were talking about earlier, that we want to be connected to the group. Like we have an evolutionary desire to be liked and included. And so we look and see what people are doing so that we can sort of conform to that. And then in terms of, these influencers, like they seem to be doing really well, right? So it's like, they appear to be so included and so much part of the group. And they also have this sort of, you could consider them experts to some extent. Like there's this like, the kind of thing where if you go to a makeup counter, like someone's wearing a, lab coat as if they're a doctor, as if they're like really professional. There's like this illusion of expertise, right? And so if you're like this major influencer and everyone's looking to you like, oh, you must be something special and I'll, listen to what you have to say. So they have like the authority, they seem really likable. And so, we follow them because we think that will make us more likable and they know what they're talking about.
It's interesting how that works, I guess, at scale. There's definitely obviously individual differences where that's completely ineffective, but it's interesting how it does very effective for many people. It's interesting. So I guess there's two things here. They're kind of connected. The first thing is why are people afraid to ask for things? You talk about this in the book. And why is it hard for people to say no? Yeah. Why? What do you make of this?
Yeah. So, when we ask for something, we really are making ourselves vulnerable. By asking for something, we're basically admitting we can't do something on our own. And we worry about being judged for what we're asking for. And we also worry that, we might not get what we're asking for, what we sort of need. So there's this risk element. And so we really worry about being rejected because, again, it's going to keep coming back to this, right? That like rejection means something more, right, than just I didn't get this thing. It means like maybe that person I just asked doesn't like me as much as I thought. If they're saying no to my request, maybe our relationship isn't as close as I thought. And all that threatens our sort of sense of connection to the group and to other people. And so asking feels very socially risky, in addition to sort of the risk of just not getting what we might need. So it's really hard to ask. And in our studies, we show that we also overestimate the likelihood that we will be rejected. Like we think it's even riskier than it turns out to be. Yeah. But then what's so fascinating is if you imagine being on the other side, being the person being asked, it's also socially risky for them to say no, right? So if they say no, they risk damaging the relationship, being seen as not a nice person or a person you want to be friends with. And so they face their own sort of set of social risks as well. That means it's really hard to say no, just like it's hard to ask. And so people are actually less likely to say no than we tend to think.
So it's interesting. So there's these themes of rejection, vulnerability, not being accepted. Why? I guess this kind of comes down to, there's an element of an individual psychology thing here, but are those just things that we just don't want to feel that way? We don't want to get hurt. We don't want, because, I think a lot of people don't want to feel those ways, but I guess, or is it more of the attribution of, well, if this is happening, it sucks to get that, and then it must mean this about myself or what I'm doing or whatever. Is it deeply tied to stronger themes, or what do you about why people don't do this or why they do it?
So I do think, it fits in with a lot of other research that's been coming out recently about how we're sort of under social, like we're kind of less willing to take certain social risks because we think other people are going to judge us more harshly than they do. And we also sort of underestimate the benefits, the potential, like the risks loom so large. And then the benefits, right? Like we underestimate how good it would feel to, connect with an old friend or, chat with someone in line at Starbucks just randomly, or these kind of social interactions, including things like ask someone for help, offer help, have these sort of social exchanges. And so there does seem to be sort of a growing consensus around this idea that there's something about social risk, like overweighing sort of the social risk of engaging with people in various ways and underweighting sort of the value of doing that. And so I think there's not really a clear sort of theory around it yet, but those are definitely themes that have been coming out of a lot of different research.
That's really interesting. So you talk about influence in a lot of positive ways. Obviously, right? The book's about influence, right? But are there any negative sides to this where we have, if people have influence, that it could be used in a negative way, or some aspects of it could be negative? Does this mean that people have to have an individual ethic of sorts in using their influence? How do you see any negative sides of influence?
Yeah, that's my bait and switch in the book, right? It's like influence is so good. Yeah. You have so much of it. Go you. And then, but wait a minute. And the big, but wait a minute really starts with this idea that we were talking about that, say I'm asking someone for help or for a favor. And we described that dynamic of like, it's hard for them to say no for all these reasons because it's socially risky, et cetera. Now, when I'm asking for a favor, in the end, like they're happy to agree. Maybe it's hard to say no, but they're going to agree and then, interpret it as like, I'm such a helpful person. They feel the warm glow of helping and everything kind of ends fine.
Yeah.
But there's other things we can ask that maybe people feel really uncomfortable saying yes to, but they also feel like they can't say no. It also feels socially risky, right? And so we have some studies where we've had participants ask people to do unethical things like tell a white lie, or in one of our studies, vandalize a library book, or it wasn't an actual library book, but a book we made look like a library book. And we found the same pattern of results that we found for asking for innocuous favors. So people thought that it would be pretty easy for people to say no to them. But in fact, the people they asked really struggled. And in those cases, they agreed more than our participants expected. And after the fact, they didn't sort of interpret it as like, oh, I'm such a helpful person, blah, blah, blah. Then they felt like, oh, wait, I just feel like I was kind of coerced to do that. Like I felt social pressure to agree to something I was uncomfortable with.
It seems here that, and maybe this is just my read on it, but it seems that intentions are important here. When people are asking for things, there's an attribution and or evaluation of, well, why? Or why do you want this? Or what's your play here? What's your motive? What's your intention here? So like, for example, the first example that came to my mind is that if a family member, sends me a message and says, hey, I need some money. Can you help me out? And my first question is going to be, how much? Right? And it depends on the relative, I guess. And if it's like, oh, I need $2,000, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to need a little bit more information here. I'm going to need some context, some background. Like, are you just like, what's going on here? But the at the end of the day, I'm not going to just give money, even if it is a family member, right? Now, maybe people listening to this would be like, oh, you're just an asshole, right? Well, that's fine. But my question is, well, what are you going to do with something I'm helping you with? Right? Or why are you asking me this? Right? Let's take out money for a minute. Let's say it's something else. Can you do me a favor? Or can you do me a solid or whatever? Sometimes the question can be, what's behind the ask? Right? What's the intention or what's the motive? And I wonder sometimes where people can misjudge that or miscalculate that, or they can view it wrongly, but it does seem to me that maybe not in all cases, but that intentions and motives become particularly important in many ways of asking for things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting too. It kind of, and I think it depends. You can tell that there's like parameters around some of these asks. Like we have our participants go out and ask for small amounts of money, like charitable donations and things like that. And generally we find our effects. But like if we were having them go out and ask, strangers for large amounts of money, I'm sure there would not be the same like, oh, sure, happy to do it. There's more of a like, okay, why would you need this? Some more probing. And it actually kind of reminds me of our conversation about the elaboration likelihood model, that there's some cases where you elaborate on, what's being asked of you, or what someone's trying to persuade you to do. And in that case, it may be that there's certain things that kind of spark your curiosity or your need to probe deeper, to ask questions why. And it's less sort of almost mindless, like, well, clearly it's like my default is just to agree because it's so much less awkward to just agree. And that, in a case where it's like, okay, someone's asking for a significant amount of money, I think it's interesting that the default still isn't no way, right? It's like, let's entertain this. Let's have a conversation, which I think is more than many people asking for that amount of money would assume. But still, it's not like it's a less sort of mindless, I think, reaction.
Yeah. I would agree. You also talk about asks, especially in the context of Me Too. What do you think about influence in the terms of dating and romantic relationships? You mentioned this in the book, right? What's your kind of snapshot of that there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time there was kind of this push that men in particular should just go for it if they were interested in someone. And you have all these like buddy movies where it's like, just go for it, ask her out. And like, there's this idea, like, what's the worst that could happen? You get a no and you move on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that sort of mentality didn't consider how asking if someone really isn't interested in you really puts them on the spot. Because even if they aren't interested in you, it's hard for them to say no, for all the reasons we've seen in these other contexts. It's, at the end of the day, people don't want to hurt other people's feelings. So there is this like pro-social like guilt there, I don't want to hurt your feelings. But also it's super awkward. And so we and other people have studies showing that when someone asks someone out, like for example, a coworker who is not interested in that person, they underestimate how uncomfortable that person is saying no. And then they also underestimate how that affects their later behaviors, like whether they avoid that person, whether they stop working on projects they were interested in order to avoid that person, whether they consider even like switching jobs or positions or something like that and spend time thinking about this. And so there are these downstream effects that often aren't considered in that space.
Yeah, I think it's there's some things about that are. I definitely see what you're saying. I think some people don't, in certain contexts, don't realize the downstream effects, which is interesting because from what I've heard and working with people and talking to people is that this is so varied, right? You could, one person could be totally fine with this and not even bat an eye, but another person would be like, dreading going to work or going to whatever event or whatever because, oh God, like this person, like I said no, and then like it's weird and it's awkward and then I'm doing this. But other people could not even care. Or, there's just so much variance here. But I do think it is important for whomever is asking. Again, it's asking a lot of people to do this because so many people don't do this, right? It's, even though if they should, what's the like 3 steps after this? Right. Just pausing to say like, okay, this and then this and this. Okay, wait a minute. How do I want to adjust? Sadly, a lot of people don't do that.
And I think you're right. Like, I definitely agree. There's a lot of variation, and sometimes, there is workplace romance. It's not like there's no chance of that. We spend a lot of time with the people we work with, so it's unrealistic to say like never date people at work, never ask people at work out. But I think knowing this kind of research and knowing this dynamic, it just makes you think twice and maybe do some simple things. Like I've heard I believe it's one of the big tech companies, this policy of you can ask someone out once and that's it. Right. So like you get your one shot, your one chance to shoot your shot. And then it doesn't turn into like harassment. It's like, okay. And then you also like, you're sure, like you're like, I'll ask at the right time. And that's the other part that I think the idea of like just go for it kind of suggests that like even if someone seems totally uninterested, you're just going to go ahead and go for it, and that creates awkwardness for no reason. So I think doing a little bit more back end research, like finding out from other people, like a good friend of this person you're interested in, are they single, might they be interested in me? And it might sound like very grade school-esque to be like, do they like me? Check yes, no. But but some sort of work to get some sense of like, is this a realistic chance? Is it worth asking?
Yeah. So one of the last things I want to ask you about is power. You talk about power in the book, and my view of power is that it's really complicated. It's really complex. So how do you define power generally? Do you agree that there's different dimensions of power? Just start with that, and then we can, I'm curious to see what you think about, how complex power is or isn't.
Yeah, no, I definitely think power is complex. And I think, some people say there's different dimensions of power. The researchers I tend to be most aligned with differentiate power from status. And so, they're both sort of sources of influence over people. They give you control over people or help you to influence people, but in different ways. And so power is really, according to this group of people, power is defined as control over resources.
Mm-hmm.
So, that could be that I could reward you with things. It could also be that I can, coerce you by taking away things, but I have some sort of control over your outcomes, be it your salary, your job, or your promotion, or any kind of outcome that you actually care about.
Mm-hmm.
And status is I respect you. So that's more I'll do things that you say and you can influence me because I hold you in high esteem and I trust the things that you're saying. And so I really focus more on power as the most sort of problematic place for example, these kinds of Me Too situations that we're talking about, and other cases where you might not recognize the influence that you have simply by having control over someone else's resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I 100% agree with you. I think that there is some, so I think in some ways the positional power is kind of preceding the person that's there, right? And I feel like sometimes people don't really get the kind of brevity of that, where it's like, okay, like, you can know me, we can be cool and nice, but like, you're in this position and that position holds power. And then you put into the mix, the person that's there and personality and temperament and, things like that. But there are aspects of, what some people call smart power, right? Or this type of intelligent power where, I'll just use a obvious example. It's the only thing I can think of. I think of someone like, President Obama, right? Who obviously was a very powerful person and he had a lot of power in many different ways. And, from people that have worked in his White House administration and others, and he was very aware and conscious of the power he had and how to use it well. Like there was an individual ethic he had that was his compass, and that goes to, like I said, character, temperament. But in that way, power was used in an adaptive way, in a way that was very helpful, in a way that was promoting transformative change and things like that. And so there are obviously dimensions of power, and there are ways in which people use power adaptively, even in those very, very high positions of being over someone or an evaluative authority or things like that. And that also is important and helpful as well. No, it's not just a one size fits all here where it's like, there's always, if you're in this power position, it's going to be abusive or whatever. It potentially could, but it doesn't mean that it always is. Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's a great point and definitely true. And I think actually being aware of your power and acknowledging it, as you said, like some people, you come into a room and you want to be everybody's buddy and you feel like, you were the low man on the ladder for like a long time and you climbed the ladder and now you show up here and you still feel like that person who worked their way up, right? You don't feel like you're the boss necessarily or someone with a lot of power. And you still feel sometimes like you have to prove yourself by like having the ideas and talking and showing why you deserve to be there. And all of that can be problematic because you really aren't aware of the power you have and how your words really are so much more powerful now that you're in this position than they were before, right? And people find it harder to speak up against you and things like that. And so there's that kind of that version of power, but then there's definitely like, as you're describing, the Obama version. And so what some researchers have talked about is people who construe, like they're aware of their power. That is the first thing, is like not being afraid to acknowledge that I am in a position of power. And then they also construe that power in terms of responsibility.
Yes.
So power comes with both opportunity, like I can make decisions now, I can do a lot of stuff, but it also comes with responsibility. So like I have the opportunity to set a new course for my team. But if I mess up and that course is no good, like I have the responsibility to my team, so I have to sort of balance both those things, and different people focus on one side versus the other. But also you can push people around. You can sort of remind people that responsibility comes with power. And some people don't like that. And they're like, well, then maybe I don't want power when you remind them, which is interesting. But the people who actually are okay with it, right, they wind up making better decisions and taking other people's perspectives into account more.
one of the things that I talk about in the different roles that I have, right, is I think about this a lot, and I think about this and talk about it a lot, is so I have positional power because I've maybe earned it or I've been fortunate to be in that position. But always means that I just have a harder job in some ways because I'm really responsible for myself, for the position, for other people. And that's sometimes a heavy weight, right? So when I teach students, I will tell them usually the first week of class, I have a lot of power in this room and in this over the semester. It doesn't mean you don't have any, you do. But I have to be really responsible and really mindful of how I am or am not using that appropriately or adaptively. As a clinician, the same thing. As a parent, same thing. And I've talked about it. I talked about it with a little bit with Megan Dahm when she was on here, about the responsibility people have when they reach a certain level of influence. When they do things like this, when they do media presentations or in the public. And I feel like a lot of people are quite immature in their understanding. There's a poverty of understanding of, if you are, it doesn't matter if you wanted it or not. If you're placed in that position and you're an athlete and you're going around and you're saying a bunch of bullshit, or if you're a very, 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 high figure that's a intellectual and you have a certain title or certain status and you're going around saying things, you have to be, as you climb higher, my view is you have to be more and more and more aware of your impact potentially and being very responsible with that. And I feel most people do not do that. Right. And it's something that drives me. That doesn't mean you have to be perfect and you can't make mistakes. Absolutely. But that's going to happen. And we should be, deal with that accordingly and be forgiving and all that. But it's just, there's not enough of a humility there and an acknowledgement of that. And so I think that's a big issue with many people in our society, especially as more people are more connected.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people, they wind up being just cavalier with the power that they have and the audiences that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is that another thing power can do is it just makes you feel like you can, say what you want, do what you want. And, it's that you don't have the same constraints as other people ultimately, because you don't need other people as much anymore once you're in that position. Because you now control the resources, if we go back to that sort of way of thinking about it. But in the end, thinking like that and like just not taking an extra beat to consider the responsibility that comes with the things that you say, and that it's so much more important, especially when you have that kind of audience. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. Well, I guess the last question I have is what's the primary message you want people to understand and realize about their own influence and the impact that could have on their personal, professional, and social lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main reasons I wrote the book was because all of the studies I talk about and the stories I talk about in the book are really reassuring to me. Whenever I worry, whether it's my students or my kids or, someone I care about, whenever I worry that like I'm not getting through to them or, feel like they're not listening or whatever it is, I remind myself that actually the research shows that they may very well be, and they're just not letting me know, or like, I just have to give them time to process or, maybe, and it kind of, it reassures me. But it also, I think, makes me ultimately, even though this wasn't my main goal, it makes me more influential because I don't push too hard. I trust that my message is getting through. So I think I wrote it so that people find it very reassuring, but then also to bring out this element of responsibility that, if people do see you, listen to you, follow you, do things for you more than you realize, that's great. But it does mean that it comes with this level of responsibility. So just kind of, use that power wisely.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, the book is called You Have More Influence Than You Think, How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. It's out everywhere in hardcover and soon in paperback. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you?
Yeah. So on my website, which is vanessabohns.com, and Bonds is Bohns, you can find places to buy the book. The book is available everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, hopefully your local bookstore. And you can find me on Twitter at Prof Bonds or Instagram at Prof Bonds.
Well, I cannot say enough thanks for coming on and for talking to me about your wonderful book. The book is great. You're a delight. And so I'm very pleased that you came on.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, thank you.